In North Carolina, a tragic car accident is blamed for the death of a 45-year-old woman. But a routine investigation raises more questions than answers. And police soon learn that things aren't always as they appear to be. A mother of 6 is found brutally murdered in her Florida home. The forensic evidence points detectives to a suspect, but his whereabouts and the motive behind the murder remain a mystery. For some killers, murder can be a profitable business. And when a victim has been targeted for death, homicide investigators must look beyond the obvious to uncover a murder for hire. On the morning of August 23, 1995, a motorist summoned rescue workers and emergency personnel to a remote area off North Carolina's Blue Ridge Parkway. While pulled over at a scenic overlook, she had spotted a van that had plunged several hundred feet down the steep embankment. There was no movement in the vehicle. Transylvania County rescue workers made their way down the cliff, hopeful they would find survivors. When the rescue worker entered the vehicle, a piece of cinder block stained with blood fell out of the van. A woman laid slumped across the front seat. She had suffered massive head injuries. There was no pulse. The body was removed from the vehicle and sent to the morgue for examination. North Carolina State Police began looking for clues to tell them how and why the vehicle went off the road.
I didn't see no skid marks with no cars.
No skid marks or any signs of sudden braking were found. And there were no indications that the driver had swerved off the road. It was likely that the woman had fallen asleep at the wheel or had been under the influence of drugs or alcohol. The van was brought up the embankment for a more detailed evaluation. A check on the vehicle's tags revealed that the van was registered to a man named Edward Kratzert, whose address was several hundred miles away in Bradenton, Florida. After finding no obvious mechanical problems with the van, technicians processed the vehicle. Reddish-brown stains were found on the exterior of the driver's side door. They tested positive for human blood. Inside, they recovered a wallet and driver's license. The driver was identified as 45-year-old Wendy Kratzert, the wife of the vehicle's owner. Blood was found throughout the van. The back of an earring was located on the passenger seat floor. Unsure what to make of the findings, investigators collected several items into evidence. Transylvania County authorities began trying to track down the victim's family to inform them of Wendy's tragic death. At autopsy, medical examiner Dr. Robert Thompson looked to the victim for clues that could explain the crash. He found no traces of drugs or alcohol in the victim's blood or tissue. Wendy's death had resulted from blunt force injuries to the head. She had suffered 5 individual fractures to the top and back of her skull. Though Wendy had not been wearing a seatbelt, for Dr. Thompson, the location and number of injuries were not typical of car crash victims.
Usually injuries that we find with automobile accidents are those in the face areas where the face comes down and hits the dashboard. So the injuries that are found were not really consistent with the automobile accident, although conceivably it could have happened that way.
The autopsy results prompted investigators from the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation to take a closer look at Wendy Kratzert's accident. Special agent and blood spatter expert Andy Klein reviewed photographs taken at the scene. He was immediately struck by the lack of blood found where the victim's body came to rest.
From the position that she came to rest in with her head in the passenger side floorboard, and with the wound being to the top and the back of her head, I would have expected to see a larger pool of blood in that floorboard had she received that wound in the van.
More troubling, however, was the presence of the victim's blood on the vehicle's exterior running board.
There was several blood spatters that I noted on the running board portion of the vehicle that would have been protected had the door been shut. So at some point the door was open and she bled on it.
All of the evidence suggested that Wendy Kratzert had been bleeding before she ever got into the van. The routine death investigation had raised more questions than answers. Police learned that Wendy and her husband owned a vacation home a few miles away from the scene of the accident. Later that night, authorities went to the address. No one appeared to be home. Then, they discovered a large pool of blood. Tests later confirmed it had come from Wendy Kratzert. An earring back, identical to the one found inside the van, was located a few inches away. Technicians concluded that no one could have survived such blood loss without immediate medical attention. Nearby, investigators found the outline of an object. Its shape was similar to the blood-stained cinder block found inside the van. For police, there could be no doubt that Wendy Kratzert had been brutally murdered. Her death had been staged to appear as an accident. After obtaining a warrant, the team made their way into the residence, unsure of what or who they might find. No one was home, and the residence showed no signs of forced entry or ransacking. Investigators thoroughly photographed the scene. They also collected numerous personal items and papers that belonged to the victim. Now, investigators had to determine who had killed Wendy and why. Transylvania County Police were eager to question Wendy's husband, Ed. He was tracked down to his home in Bradenton, Florida. Police there were contacted and asked to speak to the victim's husband. Ed Kratzert couldn't believe his wife had been murdered. He stated that since the couple's children graduated from high school, Wendy had been spending a lot of time at their vacation home in North Carolina. Ed explained that he had recently suffered a heart attack and was at home at the time of the murder. Wendy had helped nurse him back to health. And and soon after, she decided to return to North Carolina by herself. Wendy enjoyed her independence. She had even taken a part-time job as a waitress in North Carolina.
Like I said, I don't want to push anything too early right now.
Ed couldn't think of anyone who might want to harm her. Florida police confirmed Ed's alibi, and soon after, he was cleared as a suspect. Police and forensic examiners had exposed a tragic car accident as an elaborate attempt to conceal a brutal crime. But with few leads and no obvious suspects, it appeared that Wendy Kratzert's killer might get away with murder. In Transylvania County, North Carolina, a routine traffic death investigation had exposed a brutal homicide. 45-year-old Wendy Kratzert had been savagely beaten to death. Her body placed in a van, which was then pushed over a steep cliff. Frustrated by the lack of suspects or an obvious motive, police in Wendy's hometown of Bradenton, Florida, questioned the victim's friends and neighbors. One close friend told police she could think of only one person who might want to harm Wendy, and that was her husband, Ed Kratzert. Wendy had described him as ruthlessly controlling. He watched over her every move and was extremely critical of her behavior. Wendy said he could also be physically abusive. Things had become even more strained after Ed's heart attack. The medical bills had left the couple in severe financial trouble. Just before her death, Wendy had talked about leaving her husband. The findings were passed on to police in North Carolina, where Wendy's murder took place. Following up on the information, investigators learned that Ed Kratzert stood to gain $100,000 from Wendy's death. But so far, he had made no attempts to collect on his wife's insurance policy. Though Ed had misrepresented his relationship with Wendy, he had a solid alibi, and there was no motive connecting him to the crime. Desperate to identify Wendy's killer, detectives questioned her co-workers at the local restaurant where she worked part-time. One recalled that just before her death, Wendy had been tired and irritable. She said she had been dealing with unexpected house guests who had shown up from Florida on a few occasions. The co-worker didn't know the name of the visitors, but it was clear to Transylvania Homicide Detective Rita Smith that Wendy was not happy to have them in her house.
Wendy had been very uncomfortable with these people, that they had smoked in her house, that she felt that they had pilfered through her belongings.
Looking to identify the house guests, investigators scoured through the items collected from Wendy's vacation home. They found a potential clue. The names Tom and Luana Harrison had been handwritten on Wendy's calendar. And a records check revealed that the Harrisons lived in the same Bradenton, Florida neighborhood as Wendy and her husband. Florida police were dispatched to the Harrisons' home to question the couple. They admitted having visited Wendy in North Carolina a few weeks prior to her death. Tom explained that he and Luana were close friends of the Kratzerts. They spent a lot of time with the couple. They hadn't noticed any problems between Ed and Wendy. Wendy invited them to come stay at their North Carolina home whenever they wanted. She even gave them a key to the house. They took her up on the offer. But that was weeks before her murder. They hadn't been back since. As a matter of routine, the officer asked the couple their whereabouts at the time of Wendy's murder. Tom Harrison suddenly became agitated. He felt he was being treated like a suspect. He ended the interview and asked the officer to leave. Tom Harrison's odd behavior led police to believe he was hiding something.
This timeline here.
To find out what, they subpoenaed his credit card statements for the weeks surrounding the murder. They found that numerous charges had been made to hotels and car rental agencies throughout North Carolina. In fact, the receipts put Tom and Luana Harrison near the scene of the crime in the days before and just after the murder. Tom Harrison had been caught in a lie. Though police could find no motive, the circumstantial evidence was pointing to the Harrisons as Wendy Kratzert's killers. Agents from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement were contacted. They were asked to take Tom Harrison and his wife Luana into custody. As FDLE Special Agent Vince Delacchio prepared to put his team together, he received some startling news. Tom Harrison was dead.
I'd come in the morning and received a phone call from the Manatee County Sheriff's Office. The investigator there asked me if I had seen the front page of the morning paper. The front headline was, "Local man dies in boating accident."
According to reports, authorities had discovered Tom Harrison's boat burning out of control in the Gulf of Mexico. After putting out the blaze, rescue workers began a massive search to find the owner. For several days, efforts to find Tom Harrison turned up nothing. Soon after, the search was called off. The prime suspect in Wendy Kratzert's homicide was missing and presumed dead. Authorities in North Carolina believed they had finally identified the killer of 45-year-old Wendy Kratzert, whose brutal murder had been staged to look like a car accident. But as they prepared to make the arrest, they learned that their prime suspect was missing and presumed dead after his boat was found burning in the Gulf of Mexico. But authorities were convinced that Tom Harrison had staged his own death in an attempt to throw investigators off his trail. Lieutenant Marty Redmond of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission was asked to find out.
When I got to the scene and looked at the boat, I saw a vessel approximately 25 feet long that used to be a cabin-type boat. The boat had burned completely to the waterline, excepting certain portions of the starboard bow and the starboard quarter.
Fire marshals were able to quickly rule out electrical problems as the source of the blaze. After carefully analyzing the burnt remains, investigators found that some places on the boat had burned at a much higher temperature than others. And wood marred with deep, scaly scars, referred to as alligator patterns, was found next to wood that was nearly untouched by the fire. There was only one explanation for the uneven burn patterns.
The fire marshal's office determined that the fire was started with an accelerant, and where in the boat that it was started by indicators from burn patterns, different melting points of certain materials, and other items that they are skilled in looking for in charred ashes or charred remains of fires.
The fire had been intentionally set.
Well, Lieutenant.
And having found no traces of human remains among the debris, investigators were certain that Tom Harrison had set it. Lieutenant Redmond questioned Tom Harrison's wife, Luana. Careful not to reveal that examiners had exposed arson, he asked her about the circumstances surrounding her husband's mysterious death.
We can't close this case out right now.
She claimed that on the night of the fire, Tom hadn't been feeling well. After watching a late-night football game, he told her he wanted to go fishing. Concerned for his health, she tried to stop him, but there was little she could do. Tom packed up his fishing gear and left a short while later. For investigators, Luana did not appear to be the grieving widow who had just lost her husband of more than 20 years. Her only concerns were with quickly closing the investigation into Tom's death. Police soon learned why. In addition to being suspects in Wendy Kratzert's homicide, the Harrisons were in deep financial trouble. And Luana stood to collect a large life insurance settlement as a result of Tom's death. Florida Department of Law Enforcement Special Agent Vince Delacchio.
But I knew at that point in time that Thomas Harrison was not dead, and that this boating accident was more than likely a staged event, just to hide from the fact that he was a suspect in that case, and probably more than likely in knowing his situation that he was looking for some insurance money.
To test the theory, authorities put 24-hour surveillance on the Harrisons' Bradenton, Florida home. Months passed without a break. But then, police spotted Tom Harrison alive and well. And it appeared that he and Luana were preparing to leave town. Shortly after the couple hit the road, police pulled them over. Tom Harrison gave the officer a fake name and driver's license. He and Luana were placed under arrest and charged with insurance fraud and arson. But Tom Harrison was uncooperative, and with no hard evidence tying him to the homicide, investigators were still a long way from proving that he had murdered Wendy Kratzert. For police, the Harrisons' close ties with the victim's husband could no longer be ignored. Investigators began to theorize that Ed Kratzert, unhappy in his marriage to Wendy, had hired the Harrisons to kill her.
The time was right to recontact Ed Kratzert, the husband of the victim, and attempt to conduct another interview. With the fact that Harrison had been arrested, we felt as though that would open up the dialogue with Mr. Kratzert.
Kratzert was brought in for questioning and informed of Harrison's arrest. Investigators confronted him with their murder-for-hire theory and insinuated they had evidence to back it up. It was a bluff, but it worked.
Well, he said to me,
Ed Kratzert decided to talk.
I didn't know what he meant by
He confessed to taking part in the plot to murder his wife.
He can not only make it.
He insisted it wasn't his idea.
$100,000.
Kratzert said that he was complaining to the Harrisons about his marriage.
That precludes payment.
He knew Wendy was planning to leave him.
No.
After his heart attack, he was dreading the idea of a prolonged divorce and separation of assets.
Yes.
Tom Harrison told him he could make his problem go away for a fee.
We can make this problem go away.
Ed agreed. The death was supposed to look like an accident.
Done deal. Done deal. And he said
When it was exposed as a murder, Ed refused to collect on his wife's life insurance policy.
Make it look like an accident. I didn't care about the money.
The Harrisons were never paid for the job. As a result, Ed feared that Tom Harrison was plotting to kill him.
Saying that my wife was in a car accident.
Ed Kratzert was placed under arrest and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. Police confronted Tom Harrison with the statements. He refused to cooperate, but it made no difference. The credit card receipts that put him near the crime scene at the time of the murder, coupled with Ed Kratzert's confession, was all police needed to charge him with the homicide. Police believe that after showing up unexpectedly at Wendy's North Carolina vacation home, Tom Harrison bludgeoned the unsuspecting woman to death. After the kill, the couple loaded Wendy's body into her van and drove to a remote spot along the Blue Ridge Parkway, where they then attempted to stage her death as a car accident. Ed Kratzert was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife and received a sentence of no less than 11 years. Tom Harrison was sentenced to 20 years. In exchange for her testimony, Luana Harrison received 3 years probation. The Harrisons had tried to get away with murder by staging an elaborate accident. But in 1995, in the suburbs of Sarasota, Florida, one killer made no attempt to cover up his actions. On the afternoon of November 7th, 13-year-old Stevie Bellish returned home from school. No one appeared to be home. But then she stumbled upon a horrifying scene. Her mother, 35-year-old Sheila Bellish, lay dead on the kitchen floor. Panicked, the young girl called 911. Deputies and forensic technicians from the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office were immediately dispatched to the home. To prevent any contamination, a single forensic technician was allowed to enter the residence and document the scene. Sheila Bellish had been brutally murdered. She had suffered a single gunshot wound to the cheek. There were also indications that she had been viciously beaten. Her throat was so deeply cut, she was almost decapitated. As technicians began processing the crime scene, the victim's husband, Jamie Bellish, arrived home. Detectives broke the news. Police assured him that his stepdaughter, Stevie, and the couple's newly born quadruplets were all safe and unharmed. The frantic husband was escorted away from the house and taken to the police station to answer questions. Technicians looked to the blood evidence to help them piece together the events that transpired inside the house. Based on the size and location of blood spatter patterns, they determined that Sheila Bellish was initially shot near a door that led to the laundry room. Streaks of blood suggested she then attempted to crawl away from her attacker. But she was only able to get a few feet away before her killer caught up with her and slashed her throat. There was nothing to suggest that robbery was the motive. In the laundry room adjacent to the kitchen, technicians located a single .45 caliber shell casing. A few feet away lay a white towel. Some of the fabric was covered with gunshot residue, suggesting it had been used as a makeshift silencer. But for some reason, the killer only got off one shot before using a knife to finish the job. Evidence technician Lisa Lanham tried to make sense of the excessive violence inflicted on Sheila Bellish.
There are two possibilities of why he abandoned the gun. One is that the gun is very loud in a small confined area and probably sounds even louder when you're the one shooting it, and he may have feared that the neighbors would overhear the weapon. The other possibility is that the towel got caught in the gun and then basically made the gun inoperable.
Looking for any trace of the killer that may have been left behind, technicians collected dozens of prints from throughout the residence, including some found inches from the bullet casing. All of the evidence was forwarded to the Sarasota County Crime Lab. Homicide detective Chris Iorio was assigned lead detective on the case.
All I knew at that point was we did have a mother of 6 kids deceased in the kitchen, head trauma. Most likely a gunshot was involved, and we took it from there.
Investigators know from experience that their best opportunity to solve a murder falls within the first 24 hours. With few clues and no obvious suspects, they hoped an autopsy could point them to this brutal killer. Police in Sarasota, Florida struggled to find answers in the death of 35-year-old Sheila Bellish, a mother of 6 found brutally murdered in her home. At autopsy, the medical examiner recovered a .45 caliber bullet that had been fired from close range into the victim's face. It had shattered her jaw, but it was not the cause of death. A single knife wound had severed the victim's left and right jugular veins. Sheila Bellish had bled to death. There were no signs of sexual assault, and no clues to the killer's identity were found. The overkill observed at the crime scene led police to suspect that the killer was someone close to the victim. Sheila's husband, Jamie Bellish, was brought in to answer questions. He described Sheila as a dedicated mother and a loving wife. Jamie explained that he and Sheila and her 2 children from a previous marriage had recently moved to Florida from San Antonio, Texas. Sheila had just been through a nasty divorce. And when she and her new husband learned they were going to have quadruplets, they decided to start their lives over in a new city. The decision to move had not been an easy one. But according to Jamie, Sheila's ex-husband continued harassing her, even after the divorce was finalized. Jamie said that at the time of the murder, he was at work. But homicide detective Chris Iorio was taking nothing for granted.
At the beginning of the case, Jamie Bellish was our obvious suspect due to just his role in the family structure, but within, I'd say, 4 or 5 hours after we responded, we felt pretty sure that he was not involved.
Detective Iorio contacted authorities in San Antonio, Texas, and asked them to speak with Sheila's ex-husband about the murder.
Okay, how about...
What should I keep on my records? Would you like to see him?
Alan Blackthorne, a wealthy businessman, admitted that his divorce from Sheila had been bitter. But he insisted he never would have harmed the mother of his children. At the time of the murder, he was on a golfing trip in Arizona, and he had the receipts and documents to prove it.
And did anybody travel with you on this flight?
With no suspects and no obvious motive for the killing, Sarasota police turned to the physical evidence for clues. Examiners found a fingerprint that did not match any of the Bellish family members, and it had been found just inches away from the spent bullet casing. The evidence put investigators one step closer to identifying Sheila's killer. Now they needed to find out who had left that print. Detectives returned to the Bellish neighborhood to question residents about the day of the murder. One recalled seeing a Hispanic man dressed in military camouflage getting out of a white car and walking through the neighborhood. The neighbor didn't get a good look at the man's face, but was able to recall a few numbers from the license plate.
When we heard about an Hispanic male walking through the neighborhood in camouflage, we knew that most likely he didn't belong to that neighborhood. It was mostly a retirement community, and Nobody wears camouflage in this heat, and evidently it was a long sleeve shirt, long pants, and that just stood out.
A description of the man and details of the homicide were released through area newspapers. A short while later, police got a tip. A clerk who worked at a convenience store a few miles from the crime scene told police that he also saw the Hispanic man dressed in camouflage around the time of Sheila's murder.
I showed him some directions on a map.
The man had come in looking for directions. In fact, he was trying to locate the neighborhood where the young mother was found murdered.
Make your first left and the next right.
The clerk handed the man his laminated map of the area. He added that the stranger got into a white car and drove off. Officers collected the laminated map, hopeful the suspect had left his prints behind. At the crime lab, examiners located several prints on the map. Evidence technician Lisa Lanham then compared them to the suspect's prints that were recovered from the crime scene. She found a match. Police had identified a suspect and had evidence that could tie him to the crime scene. Now they needed to know his name. All they had was a partial license plate number from his vehicle. It wasn't much to go on.
We initially ran a tag out of Florida. I mean, a lead's a lead, you have to try. And it came back to nothing. And then we decided, since the Bellishes were from Texas, that'd be the next state to try. And when we got that tag, the information back, it was registered to somebody in Texas, so we had to follow up that lead.
Investigators traced the white vehicle to a 21-year-old Austin, Texas resident named Jose Joey Del Toro.
We ran a background check on Jose Del Toro. As soon as we got his name, we did find out that he had a criminal history, but nothing that would make you believe he was a murderer.
But that was a conclusion forensic scientists would have to make. Joey Del Toro's fingerprint card was forwarded to the Sarasota County Crime Lab. There, examiners compared his prints to those recovered from the Bellish home. After careful scrutiny, they concluded that Joey Del Toro had left the print. A warrant was issued for his arrest. Police in Del Toro's hometown of Austin, Texas, were unable to track down the suspect. However, they did manage to locate his white vehicle. Armed with a warrant, investigators processed the car. Inside a bag, they collected a Colt .45 caliber semi-automatic handgun. It was the same type of weapon used to shoot Sheila Bellish. To nail their case against Joey Del Toro, investigators forwarded the weapon to ballistics experts at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement Crime Lab. First, the weapon was fired into a water tank. The water slows the bullet's flight without distorting the unique marks left behind as it passes through the gun barrel. The rounds collected from the water tank could then be compared to the bullet recovered from Sheila Bellish's cheek. Under a comparison microscope, examiners found that the striation marks that are unique to each gun were identical on both bullets. All of the forensic analysis left investigators with no doubt that Joey Del Toro had murdered the young mother of 6. But having found no obvious connection between the killer and the victim, the motive behind the savage slaying was as mysterious as the killer's whereabouts. Police in Sarasota, Florida, had finally linked a suspect to the murder of 35-year-old mother of 6, Sheila Bellish. found brutally beaten, shot, and stabbed in her home. All of the evidence suggested that 21-year-old Joey Del Toro committed the murder and then fled to Texas. But so far, all efforts to locate him had gone unsuccessful. Then, police got a tip that the fugitive was staying with relatives in San Antonio. For help, Florida police contacted the Texas Rangers stationed there. But authorities there had no luck finding the suspect. However, they managed to track down his cousin, a man named Sammy Gonzalez. He agreed to come in and answer questions. Texas Rangers Lieutenant Gary De Los Santos conducted the interview. Sammy Gonzalez claimed he had no idea where his cousin Joey Del Toro might be. But he believed he had information about the murder. He said that a few months back, an acquaintance of his, a golf hustler named Danny Rocha, had tried to hire him to beat somebody up. Sammy was interested in the job, but when he saw the intended victim, he declined. But he knew someone else who might be interested in the job.
Sammy admitted to us that he was approached by Danny Rocha and was asked to beat up a girl. Once Sammy realized it was a woman, he refused to do it, but he brought up to his cousin Joey Del Toro that maybe he would be willing to do it.
Sammy claimed that he didn't know if his cousin had taken the job, and he didn't ask why the woman had been targeted. Unsure what to make of the information, investigators began digging into the golf hustler's background. They were surprised by what they found. Danny Rocha was a close associate of Sheila Bellish's wealthy ex-husband. Suddenly, investigators had to consider that they had exposed a murder-for-hire scheme. Police knew that Sheila's divorce had been bitter. But had it led to murder? One friend who knew the couple well thought so. Sheila had described her ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne, as obsessive and controlling. During their divorce, he had demanded that Sheila sign over custody of their children. When she refused, Blackthorne had her falsely arrested for child abuse. The charges were ultimately dismissed, and Sheila was awarded custody of the children. Alan Blackthorne allegedly said that he would get even. According to the friend, Sheila took the threat seriously. When Sheila and her new family moved to Florida, they kept an unlisted phone number and took pains to keep their new address a secret. Now, investigators looked for proof that the victim's ex-husband had orchestrated her murder. Danny Rocha, the person police believe had hired the hitman, was brought in for questioning. Under advice of his attorney, he refused to answer any questions. Before letting him go, however, Lieutenant De Los Santos asked Rocha to pose for a photograph with him. He agreed. The following day, Sammy Gonzalez was brought in for another interview. Police were convinced he knew more about the murder plot than he claimed. When shown the photograph, Sammy became convinced that Danny Rocha was cooperating with authorities. Fearing he had been implicated in the murder, he decided to talk. Now, he admitted that he had accepted $14,000 from Danny Rocha to murder Sheila Bellish. A short while later, he hired his cousin to actually carry out the homicide. Sammy believed that Sheila Bellish's ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne, had ordered and financed the murder. He also told investigators where they could find the hitman, Joey Del Toro. Soon after, Del Toro was tracked down to a motel in Mexico. He was placed under arrest and, after extensive legal wrangling, extradited back to the United States to stand trial for murder. Authorities had now exposed 3 conspirators in the murder of Sheila Bellish. But the alleged mastermind, Alan Blackthorne, was still a free man. Looking to find evidence linking him to the murder, investigators subpoenaed his phone records for the months prior to the homicide. One number that continually popped up was traced to the bail bondsman who had helped Sheila get out of jail when she was falsely arrested. The bondsman said he recorded all of his phone conversations. Police realized that he would have been one of the few people to have a record of Sheila Bellish's most current address.
Once we got those recordings, that's when you hear Alan Blackthorne, and there's a person calling in pretending to be somebody else and trying to ascertain Sheila's address.
Investigators confirmed that just before the murder, Alan successfully located Sheila's Florida address. The evidence, along with the testimony of the other conspirators, was enough to arrest the wealthy businessman.
Real well by now.
On January 4th, 2000, Alan Blackthorne was taken into custody and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. At trial, police learned that soon after his divorce from Sheila, Alan Blackthorne began plotting to kill her. While on a golfing trip, Blackthorne told his associate, Danny Rocha, that his ex-wife was an abusive mother and he wanted it stopped, even if it meant killing her. Danny Rocha agreed to set it up. After acquiring Sheila's address in Florida, the hitman drove from Texas to the Bellish home. Joey Del Toro broke into the residence and waited for his opportunity. He caught the unsuspecting mother completely off guard. For their role in the murder, Joey Del Toro and Danny Rocha each received life sentences. Sammy Gonzalez was sentenced to 19 years. Alan Blackthorne was found guilty of orchestrating his wife's death and sentenced to life in prison. For some, money is motive enough to commit murder. When there are no obvious connections between killer and victim, detectives turn to forensic examiners to expose the mastermind behind a murder for hire. On Maryland's eastern shore, a couple's romantic weekend getaway turns lethal when a man dies in a deadly blaze. Though all of the evidence suggests a tragic accident, a routine investigation exposes some troubling irregularities. In Florida, an apparently healthy woman dies in her home, and examiners can find nothing to explain the death. Though police suspect murder, years will pass before new forensic technology offers any hope of proving it. When an untraceable poison is used to commit murder, homicide detectives face a difficult challenge. For help, they turn to forensic toxicologists to follow a killer's tracks and expose a toxic death. St. Michael's is an historic fishing village turned resort on Maryland's eastern shore. Quaint, tree-lined streets and old homes and boutiques have made it a popular weekend getaway.
Talbot County 911.
In the early morning hours of February 15, 1998, an emergency dispatcher received a frantic call from a clerk at a local resort.
Is there anybody in the room?
One of the rooms was on fire, and he believed a guest was trapped inside.
East and I-36, respond to St. Michael's Resort. Fire. At least one subject in the room.
Within minutes, rescue workers from the Talbot County Fire Department and officers from the Maryland State Police arrived at the location. The blaze, confined to a single room, was quickly brought under control. Though the hotel clerks had managed to pull the guest from the room, the victim, 35-year-old Stephen Rico, was pronounced dead at the scene. His face had been burned beyond recognition. Police learned that shortly before 1:30 a.m., the victim's wife rushed into the hotel lobby to report that her room was on fire. The clerks called 911 and then rushed to the room. They found the victim lying in bed and quickly pulled him out. But it was too late. The victim's wife, 33-year-old Kim Rico, said she and her husband Steve were spending Valentine's weekend together.
Give me a little bit here.
Earlier that evening, she and Steve had dinner with friends at the hotel's dinner theater.
Your wife is okay. Have a little
Kim said Steve had been drinking heavily and had taken antidepressants and cold medication.
Oh, well, why don't we have a toast to you, honey?
Kim said that Steve became sloppy drunk.
Cheers, Mom.
It's so bad.
She and her husband returned to their room a few hours later. Steve continued to drink. Then he began pressuring her for sex.
You're drunk, and I'm not interested. No, I'm just not interested.
When Kim refused, he became angry. To avoid a fight, she grabbed her things and left to go for a drive. When she returned a few hours later, she made her way into the room and was immediately overcome by smoke. She couldn't believe her husband of 10 years was gone.
What kind of cigars does he smoke?
Investigators searched for answers to explain the deadly blaze. Maryland Deputy State Fire Marshal Mike Mulligan began by looking for the fire's origin.
The point of origin is key in determining the cause of a fire and determining whether it was accidental or purposely set. And what you do is you begin at the area of least fire damage and you progress into the most fire damage. And the idea is that at the spot where you have the most fire damage, the fire has been burning the longest.
On the nightstand next to the bed, investigators found their first clue: a partially melted soft drink bottle.
The heat softened the plastic on the side that faced the fire while it was still cold on the other side, and the plastic began to melt and pointed the neck of the bottle toward the point of origin.
The fire had apparently started near the pillow, where Stephen Rico's head would have been. Burn patterns showed its progress across the bed and down to the charred carpet. Then, investigators uncovered a possible cause of the fire. On the bedside table, they found an open package of cigars. One was missing. For fire marshals, the reason behind the blaze seemed tragically clear.
We could eliminate the electrical, we could eliminate the heating and the air conditioning units, we could eliminate the wood-burning stove, and what did that leave us with? Well, one of the possibilities was careless smoking.
At autopsy, the medical examiner found that Stephen Rico had suffered severe burns to his head, arms, and torso. But surprisingly, no traces of soot or carbon monoxide were found in the victim's lungs. That suggested he had stopped breathing before the room had filled with smoke. Having found no cause of death, blood and tissue samples were collected for further analysis. Toxicologists at the Maryland State Police Crime Lab confirmed that there was no carbon monoxide present in the victim's blood or tissue. And blood alcohol test results were 0.00%. Examiners found no evidence suggesting that Steve had been drinking or taking pills, as his wife claimed. The results were passed on to the Maryland State Police. Homicide Detective Joe Gamble struggled to reconcile all the facts of the case.
They could not determine how he died. They could tell us that he didn't die of any natural causes. There was no alcohol in Stephen's blood, no soot or carbon monoxide in his lungs. That did not jive with what Kimberly Rico told us that night.
To resolve the inconsistencies, detectives questioned the victim's wife again. Kim Rico was surprised by the lab findings. In addition to drinking heavily at dinner, Steve had purchased beer and cigars earlier that day. She admitted her marriage had been rocky, but claimed she and Steve had managed to work out their problems. Everything had been going so well. As the questioning continued, Kim grew nervous. Then she asked for an attorney and ended the interview. To find out what Kim Rico was hiding, police contacted the couple's friends. All agreed that Kim and Steve had been working hard to salvage their marriage. But none of the friends had ever known Steve to smoke cigars. The inconsistent information, in addition to the autopsy findings, led investigators to suspect that Steve Rico's death had not resulted from an accident, as his wife suggested. To prove it, they would first need to determine exactly how the fire started. They turned to arson investigators at the Maryland State Fire Marshal's office. At a training facility in eastern Maryland, fire marshals looked to recreate the damage observed at the scene. They lit the same brand of cigar found inside the room and placed it on a pillow they'd obtained from the hotel. It smoldered, then went out. The ash from the lit cigar failed to ignite the flame-retardant pillow.
We took the cigars and placed them on the pillows. Did this repeatedly for approximately an hour and a half. And what the test showed us was that careless smoking could not have been the cause of ignition caused by the pillow.
Though investigators now suspected an accelerant had been used to start the blaze, lab tests failed to expose any traces of a flammable substance. However, the accelerant might have burned away during the fire. The only other way investigators could ignite the pillow and recreate the burn damage was by applying a makeshift torch directly to it.
The test confirmed that the fire was incendiary in nature, that it was not an accidental fire. It was not a cause of careless smoking.
The fire had been intentionally set. The findings were passed on to police. Soon after, Stephen Rico's death was officially classified as a homicide. Authorities on Maryland's eastern shore proved that a hotel room fire that claimed the life of 35-year-old Steve Rico was not the result of careless smoking, as his wife Kim suggested. Having found no traces of smoke in the victim's lungs, it was also clear that Steve Rico was already dead when the fire was set. But the medical examiner was unable to determine exactly how he died. All of the findings led police to believe that Kim Rico had murdered her husband. Now they looked for physical evidence to prove it. Police tracked down her co-workers at a Washington, D.C. hospital, where she was employed as a surgical technician.
Did she ever bring up her husband?
No one believed Kim was capable of murder.
Yeah, she did a couple of times, as a matter of fact.
However, one doctor did recall an unusual conversation he had with her a month earlier.
I've been meaning to talk to you about that.
Kim had been complaining about her marriage and jokingly offered him $50,000 to kill her husband.
What are you talking about?
Not taking her seriously, he joked back, telling her she could put Stephen to sleep forever by injecting him with a drug called succinylcholine.
Now, what would that do to somebody?
Kim's co-worker described the drug as a powerful muscle relaxant used to prevent involuntary movement during surgery.
1900.
As a surgical technician, Kim used it nearly every day. Homicide detective Joe Gamble.
Kimberly Rico's profession was significant working as a surgical technician, in that she had access to certain drugs that other people in the hospital and that normal citizens don't have access to. One of those drugs, is we learned, was succinylcholine.
Though toxicology tests turned up no traces of the drug in Stephen Rico's body, detectives learned that succinylcholine breaks down almost immediately, leaving no detectable traces behind. In essence, the drug is a perfect murder weapon.
It's injected into the tissue, doesn't have to go into the bloodstream, and it causes your muscles to relax, which includes your heart and your diaphragm and your breathing. And with enough succinylcholine, you just stop breathing and your heart stops and you die.
With the homicide investigation taking on a clearer focus, detectives returned to the crime scene. While they searched the hotel for a syringe or a drug vial, divers combed the Miles River, located directly behind the resort. They spent hours combing the bottom of the river and the surrounding area. But their search turned up nothing. A few days later, however, a hotel employee found something lying in the grass. It was a discarded syringe. The evidence was forwarded to the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. A thorough analysis of the needle failed to produce any traces of the victim's blood or succinylcholine. Examiners applied a laser light to the evidence, hoping to find fingerprints that may have been left behind. But all of their efforts turned up nothing. With no obvious motive or a murder weapon, investigators would have to rely on the circumstantial evidence to prove that Kim Rico had killed her husband. And their best hope was to establish that she had staged the crime scene to throw investigators off her trail.
So we set out, of course, to find out where the alcohol came from and where the cigars came from, hopefully proving that Kimberly bought these things or purchased these things to stage the room, to set the room up.
I wonder if I could take a couple minutes of your time. Checking to see if a woman
Detective
may
Gamble
have
canvassed
stopped
convenience stores near the resort.
cigars recently.
He found a clerk who recalled a woman matching Kim Rico's description. The store employee told him that around the time of the murder, the woman came in to purchase a 6-pack of beer and a pack of cigars.
I don't know why you need to say that. I'm obviously of age.
The customer had made a lasting impression on the clerk.
Who dyes your hair?
The store clerk remembered Kimberly that day because Kimberly was particularly rude. Kimberly had been so abrupt with her, and that stood out in the store clerk's mind. That's how she was able to remember her.
Police collected a package of cigars like the ones purchased by Kim Rico.
Price tag on that.
They were the same brand found in the Rico's hotel room. Investigators also collected the stamp gun used to attach the price stickers to the merchandise.
Mark everything in the store with? Thanks for your time.
The items were delivered to forensic document examiner Joan DiMartino at the Maryland State Police Crime Lab. To establish a link between the evidence, she began comparing the characteristics of the price sticker on the cigar pack found at the crime scene to the one collected from the convenience store.
The characteristic of most significance would be the design cuts, the tamper-proof die cuts that cause something to break away if say, a ne'er-do-well person wanted to peel off the price tag, it would break away. These are common to a particular manufacturer.
A visual inspection revealed no differences between all of the stickers collected. Using an infrared light source, DiMartino looked for commonalities and differences within the ink itself. She found that the dyes and pigments that make each ink unique were the same on both cigar packs. They had all originated from the same stamp gun collected from the convenience store. Kim Rico had purchased the cigars found at the crime scene, something she had previously denied. Police were building a strong circumstantial case against Kim Rico. But having revealed no official cause of death and no obvious motive behind the homicide, investigators were still a long way from proving murder. Maryland police were convinced that 33-year-old surgical technician Kim Rico had murdered her husband with an untraceable drug, then staged the scene to make his death appear as a tragic accident. But so far, all of the evidence amassed against her was circumstantial. Looking to uncover a motive, police re-interviewed people close to the couple.
Talk to you about Kimberly. I understand that you're friends with her?
One friend admitted that just before Stephen's death, Kim said that she wanted to divorce him. Kim had been having an affair with a man she'd met a few months before. They'd been spending a lot of time together. And Kim was no longer interested in salvaging her marriage to Steve. But Kim was dreading a prolonged and costly divorce. The information was enough for investigators to obtain a warrant to search Kim's home. There, in a desk drawer, they found 2 life insurance policies taken out on Stephen Rico. Kim stood to gain $200,000 from her husband's death. It was the break homicide detectives had been looking for.
We felt that Kimberly had motive. She had a large amount of money to gain. She had been involved in an affair that she wanted to move forward with. And those were the 2 things that we felt that Kimberly wanted to gain by the murder of Stephen Rico.
We got out of Kim Rico's house on Bellamy.
A warrant was issued for Kim Rico's arrest. But before police could act, they received some startling information.
Where's she at?
Kim Rico had attempted suicide.
How long ago was that? Okay.
One of Kim's friends had become concerned when she hadn't heard from her in some time. When she went to check on her, she found Kim unconscious on the floor. An empty bottle of pills lay nearby. Kim Rico, the prime suspect in her husband's death, was rushed to a nearby hospital. Though she was in critical condition, medical personnel had gotten to her on time. A few days later, Kim Rico was released from the hospital. Police were there waiting.
Are you Kimberly Rico? Okay, right now I have a warrant for your arrest.
She was taken into custody and charged with murder.
You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to return to
Based on the evidence, investigators believe that Kimberly Rico was driven by greed and a desire to further her affair. On February 15, 1998, she injected her unsuspecting husband with the untraceable drug succinylcholine. It paralyzed him immediately. She staged the scene to make it appear Stephen had been drinking beer and smoking cigars. Then she set the room on fire. Kimberly Rico was convicted of arson and first-degree murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. In Maryland, the circumstantial evidence alone was enough to convict Kim Rico of killing her husband. But in Florida, investigators would need irrefutable scientific proof in order to win a murder conviction. Situated in Bay County, on Florida's coastal panhandle, lies the affluent and peaceful community of Panama Beach. There, around 9 a.m. on the morning of May 30th, 1991, 18-year-old Jennifer Cybers went into her parents' bedroom to wake up her mother, Kay. But Kay wasn't responding. Panicked, Jennifer called her father, Florida State Medical Examiner. He told her not to worry. He was sending help and said he would be there shortly.
Okay. Okay.
Emergency workers and a doctor from the medical examiner's office were dispatched to the scene. Kay was unresponsive and showed no signs of life. The 52-year-old mother of three was pronounced dead at the scene, the apparent victim of a heart attack. A Bay County Sheriff's deputy heard the call over the radio and responded to the house.
I'd like to speak to you outside.
He was informed that the death had resulted from natural causes and he wasn't needed.
I'd like to speak to you outside if I could.
A short while later, the victim's husband, medical examiner Dr. William Cybers, arrived at the house. He learned that his wife of more than 20 years was gone.
Any idea what caused it? Jimmy should be in the room, but I need to get to her. Make sure
Dr. Cybers asked that her body be taken directly to the funeral home. The following day, agents from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement received a call. An anonymous informant was troubled by several irregularities surrounding Kay's death and the actions of her husband. After hearing all of the details, Special Agent Scotty Sanderson agreed to take a closer look at Dr. Cybers.
Certain red flags came up. He was a medical examiner. No autopsy had been performed. Kay Cybers was in apparent good health. He did not call 911 after learning of her distress, and the police were notified and sent to the home, but were asked to leave by staff of Dr. Cybers.
As a medical examiner, Dr. Cybers knows that all unattended deaths require that an autopsy be performed. His wife's was no exception. To find out why he hadn't followed protocol, investigators arranged for an interview.
It's important that an autopsy be conducted. Could you tell me why you didn't order an autopsy?
Dr. Cybers admitted he had made a mistake.
And I just
He was distraught and wasn't thinking clearly.
no better family.
He loved Kay very much. And her death was completely unexpected.
Enjoyed ourselves. Very pleasant.
The night before she died, the two had gone out for a nice dinner.
Later on, she felt that she had a little.
I've got a really bad chest pain.
But around 4 a.m., she woke him up.
I can hardly breathe. It hurts when I breathe.
Kay was experiencing pain in her chest and left shoulder.
Draw some blood for her.
Dr. Cybers was concerned. Kay had a family history of heart disease and diabetes,
Just try to relax.
but she refused to go to the hospital.
Let me see if I can put your arm down a minute.
Dr. Cybers said he tried to draw some blood so he could have it tested the following morning.
Ouch!
But he said he botched the job.
Ow! Ow, Bill!
After 2 unsuccessful attempts, he gave up.
I'll be right back. Lay back.
Eventually, Kay fell back asleep.
She was fine.
Dr. Cybers said he called to check up on her several times the following morning, but he never got through.
See if she wanted to take something for her.
As a matter of routine, Agent Sanderson asked for the syringe, but Dr. Cybers didn't have it. He said that on his way to work the following morning, he tossed the needle in the trash and then disposed of the garbage in a dumpster a few blocks away.
Trash to the dumpster.
Yes.
Is that typically what your family does with the household garbage?
Most of our garbage, yes.
Dr. Cybers, is there...
All of the information, including the manner in which the needle was disposed, troubled Agent Sanderson.
He's a physician. He has a needle on a syringe exposed in a household garbage, throwing it in the garbage bin supposedly down the street. All of these different factors were alarming me and the other agents that were with me about what we were going to be working.
Troubled by all of the irregularities, investigators began looking deeper into Kay Cybers' medical history. FDLE Special Agent Dennis Norred pored over her records, looking for any clue that might help explain her death. He found no records suggesting she suffered from diabetes or heart disease, as her husband claimed.
We had gathered documents from the time that Kay was born up until the time that she had died in Panama City. And there was nothing to ever indicate that she would have experienced any type of health problems.
The information suggested that Dr. Cybers was not being truthful about his wife's medical history. To find out why, investigators needed to examine the victim's body. After obtaining a warrant, authorities were dispatched to the funeral home to retrieve Kay's remains. They arrived just in time.
Agents were dispatched to that funeral home where they found she had been embalmed and was in a casket for showing, and they were about to transport her body back to her home in Iowa.
Dr. Cybers, it seemed, was in a hurry to bury his wife. Kay Cybers' body was transported to an independent medical examiner's office located in Pensacola. It was now up to them to determine if her death had resulted from natural causes or something else. Authorities in Bay County, Florida, looked to explain the death of Kay Cybers, a seemingly healthy 52-year-old mother of 3 found dead in her home. Though her husband, medical examiner Dr. William Cybers, claimed she had a history of heart disease and diabetes, her medical records told a different story. Investigators hoped an autopsy would give them answers. Medical examiner Dr. Gary Cumberland looked to pinpoint a specific cause of death. An external examination revealed the presence of 2 distinct puncture marks on the victim's right arm. That was consistent with Dr. Cybers' claim that he tried to draw blood from her shortly before her death. But the marks were also consistent with something being injected into the body.
I've seen some fresh image around these, so I think that they occurred before she died. So let's make sure that we get some of that tissue for toxicology as well as general histology.
Dr. Cumberland focused his internal examination on the victim's heart. There was no evidence of disease or any signs of damage. In fact, all of the victim's organs seemed healthy. Dr. Cumberland found nothing to explain why Kay Cybers had died so suddenly. Troubled by the findings, he collected tissue and blood samples for further analysis.
Basically, what we have is a person who died with no natural disease process responsible for her death. And in those instances, we start looking for toxicologic agents, i.e., is there some drug or poison that she had been given that resulted in her death?
The samples were forwarded to the Dade County Medical Examiner's office. But toxicologists were at a disadvantage. Kay Cybers' body had been embalmed soon after her death, and those fluids had likely destroyed any traces of drugs or poisons that may have been injected into her system. Test results turned up negative. The findings did little to ease investigators' suspicions that Kay Cybers had met with foul play.
And we have agents that will be accompanying this material down to my...
Despite the lack of hard evidence, they refused to close the case. Though the victim's husband explained the puncture marks on Kay's arms had resulted from an attempt to draw blood, investigators formulated a different theory. They speculated he had injected her with a lethal drug. But a search of dumpsters near the couple's house failed to produce a syringe or any evidence that could prove it. Investigators turned to the couple's children, hopeful they could shed light on a possible motive for murder. But the Cybers' daughter insisted that her parents' relationship was strong.
She seemed normal, seemed fine.
Her father was dedicated to Kay and the children. The daughter said she had last seen her mother the night before she died.
Yeah. Wonderful. We went to that new restaurant with Mama's.
When her parents returned home from dinner, they seemed happy, and both were in good moods.
Okay. Good night, Daddy. I'll be up in a little bit.
She and her mother stayed up and talked for some time.
It was good. It was really good. School was fun. Oh.
You know anything about her medical history?
None of the children believed that their father had anything to do with their mother's death.
Appreciate you coming in. Thank you.
The investigation was going nowhere.
Jerry, beloved, we do thank you for coming today.
Authorities had no choice but to release the victim's body to her family.
Every one of you here with us today.
Kay Cybers' remains were flown to her hometown in Iowa. There, she was laid to rest. But agents refused to give up. They scoured through the case files, looking for anything they may have overlooked. In his statements to police, Dr. Cybers claimed he had tried to telephone his wife numerous times on the morning of her death to check on her. Investigators subpoenaed his cell phone records and found he was telling the truth. But FDLE agent Dennis Norrid noticed something else.
Over about a 3-month time period, there were approximately 140 some odd calls made from Dr. Cybers to a particular phone number.
2 of those calls took place on the morning of Kay's death. The number was traced to a former lab technician who worked with Dr. Cybers. The woman admitted that the 2 were close friends.
At the hospital, I cared for him.
He had called her the day of Kay's death, but she said he was grief-stricken and just wanted to be consoled.
We weren't romantically involved.
But investigators sensed she wasn't telling them everything. Under persistent questioning, she admitted she and Dr. Cybers were romantically involved. Initially, she considered him a father figure.
Same here.
But as they began spending more time together, her feelings for him deepened. And soon, they fell in love.
How do you relate to him?
She didn't believe he was capable of murder. Investigators disagreed. Dr. Cybers wasn't the dedicated husband and father he portrayed himself to be. They theorized he had murdered his wife in order to clear the way to pursue his affair. Police forwarded Kay Cybers' tissue samples collected at autopsy to the National Medical Services Lab in Willow Grove, Pennsylvania, one of the most advanced forensic labs in the country. There, renowned toxicologist Dr. Frederick Reeders agreed to look into the case. And after reviewing Kay Cybers' autopsy report, he found a potential clue. An elevated level of potassium had been detected in her eye fluid. Though potassium occurs naturally in the body in small amounts, if a large dose is injected into a person's bloodstream, it will cause the heart to stop immediately. In the normal human body, potassium and iron are found in equal amounts within red blood cells. To find out if Kay Cybers had an unnatural amount of potassium in her body, toxicologists used a newly developed system that measures the ratio of potassium to iron. The procedure was successful. Dr. Reeders reviewed the findings.
The ratio of potassium to iron in critical areas were much higher than normal, which led me to the conclusion that potassium had been administered to this person, and that was potentially a cause of death for it.
The findings had provided powerful evidence that Kay Cybers had not died of natural causes. But to confirm the results, examiners needed additional samples from the victim's body. For investigators, that presented a problem. In the state of Iowa, where Kay Cybers was buried, state law will only allow a body to be exhumed if the family gives its consent. Dr. Cybers, who insisted he had nothing to hide, refused to give his permission. Desperate not to let their case slip away, authorities turned to Florida State's Attorney Harry Shorstein for help. He agreed to prosecute the case.
Thank you.
But almost immediately, he faced a crushing setback. The only scientific evidence that could prove murder had been challenged by defense experts. Because potassium occurs naturally in the body, the judge ruled that without additional samples, there was insufficient evidence to prove that Kay Cybers had been administered a lethal dosage.
Very simply stated, when you die, your red blood cells almost immediately break down. They're full of potassium, and as a result, the potassium within your body goes everywhere. And the general thought among the scientific community is that if you're injected with potassium, unless you could get to the body almost immediately, you couldn't distinguish between the potassium that had been injected in the body and the potassium that is within your body naturally.
Despite the court's conclusions, everything authorities had learned convinced them Dr. Cybers had murdered his wife. But until they could find irrefutable evidence, they would be unable to prove it. Several years had gone by since the 1991 death of 52-year-old Kay Cybers. Though toxicology tests convinced Florida authorities that her husband had injected her with a lethal dose of potassium, the court ruled the findings were inadmissible. Still, Special Prosecutor Harry Shorstein didn't believe that Kay Cybers died of heart disease, as her husband, medical examiner William Cybers, had suggested.
The examination of the heart that had taken place at the autopsy showed no indication whatsoever of any heart disease, and we were going to proceed with the trial without an actual cause of death, just based on the circumstantial evidence.
In February of 1997, a warrant was issued for the arrest of Dr. William Cybers. He had since retired and married the woman he had been having an affair with. He voluntarily turned himself in to police. Because of health problems, he was released on $300,000 bail, but not before being fitted with an electronic monitoring device. He was only allowed to leave his home to visit attorneys and to attend church. With the trial approaching, prosecutors struggled to prepare their case for a jury. Then, they received some unexpected news. In the years since Kay Cybers' death, toxicologists at the National Medical Services Lab in Willow Groves, Pennsylvania, had developed new forensic tests that could detect previously untraceable poisons. Though the samples collected at autopsy were several years old, according to Dr. Kevin Ballard, they had been well preserved.
The tissues from Ms. Cybers were taken from her at the time of her original autopsy, but she had already been embalmed. Those tissues, those organs, were maintained frozen during all the years between the time of her death and the time of our analyses.
First, Dr. Ballard wanted to test the samples for the presence of paralyzing drugs. These drugs are known to increase potassium levels in the body, which might explain why high levels of potassium were found in Kay's tissue samples years earlier. He subjected the samples to a process called QTOF, which stands for quadrupole time of flight. Essentially, the process acts as a molecular microscope. First, all of the molecules that are present in the sample are separated. Each individual molecule is then broken down into pieces. Using sophisticated detection equipment, the individual pieces are then weighed. The molecular weight of the samples is then compared to the molecular weight of known paralyzing drugs. In tissue samples taken from Kay Cybers' kidney, the analysis revealed lethal amounts of the drug succinylcholine.
Succinylcholine and these other paralyzing drugs, when they're administered to a person, They paralyze the skeletal muscles of our bodies. These are the muscles that move our limbs. They also paralyze the specialized skeletal muscle, which is the diaphragm, which is the primary muscle that we use when we breathe. So part of the effect is to stop a person's breathing.
Done the preliminary interviews of the family members.
The analysis had finally given investigators the evidence they needed to prove murder. As a physician, the victim's husband had easy access to the drug and the knowledge to use it with deadly effect. Driven by the desire to further his affair and to avoid a costly divorce, police believe that on May 30th, 1991, Dr. William Cybers injected his wife with a lethal amount of the paralyzing drug. He then tried to use his position as chief medical examiner to conceal his crime.
State of Florida versus William
In January 2000, Dr. William Cybers was convicted of the murder of his wife, Kay.
So we all done at Pensacola, Escambia County, Florida.
He was sentenced to life in prison.
Date 3/23/2001.
Some killers believe that by using an untraceable drug, their crimes will go unpunished. But with each advance in forensic science, there are fewer poisons that can escape detection. And that means a better chance for investigators to solve those once elusive cases of toxic death. Canadian police are on the hunt for a missing woman. Though all indications suggest murder, they must rely on a single strand of animal hair to prove it. When an Ohio woman vanishes, suspicions swirl around her husband. What police lack is hard evidence. In Missouri, a man is found brutally murdered.
Doesn't look like it.
To catch his killer, police must piece together his final minutes. Sometimes, the murder suspect is immediately apparent, but the proof remains elusive. When there are no witnesses to speak for a victim, forensic scientists must transform the smallest clue into a material witness. Tucked away in the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the southeast corner of Canada lies the remote and sparsely populated Prince Edward Island. On October 7th, 1994, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, responded to a complaint about an abandoned vehicle found on private property. When the constable arrived, he discovered the car resting a few hundred yards off a private road. No tags were present.
41 to base.
A check on the vehicle identification number revealed it was registered to a woman named Shirley Duguay.
Number IG4, AB69.
Police arranged to have the vehicle impounded and then began trying to track down the owner. But when the woman failed to return their calls, detectives decided to go to her address. There, they were met by Shirley Duguay's father and her children's babysitter. The news of the abandoned car concerned them. Shirley, they said, had not been heard from in some time. The babysitter said that she last saw the 32-year-old mother of 5 4 days earlier. Shirley was leaving to run some errands. She never mentioned where she was going. She said goodbye and promised to be back in a few hours. For RCMP Inspector Alphonse McNeil, the story had raised a troubling question.
We wondered why they didn't report her missing. They said that they were concerned that an ex-common law spouse by the name of Douglas Beamish, who she had the three young children with, would end up getting the children if social services found out that she was missing or gone. So they tried to hold back that information as long as they could, hoping that they would find her.
For investigators, the time for waiting was over. Fearing that harm may have come to Shirley Duguay, police processed her abandoned vehicle for clues. What they found was not encouraging. Dozens of tiny reddish-brown stains tested positive for human blood. And barely visible bloodstain patterns found on the windshield and larger ones on the seats were consistent with having been caused by someone being punched or bludgeoned.
There was blood in the vehicle. Shirley Duguay had been missing for 4 days, so we were concerned that Shirley Duguay had met some form of demise in that vehicle.
Investigators returned to the area where the abandoned car had been found. For hours, the search for clues to the young woman's fate turned up nothing. Then, 500 meters from where the car was discovered, investigators found something. It was a pillow stained with what appeared to be blood. And a short distance away lay a blood-stained t-shirt. A shovel was also found nearby. All of the findings pointed to murder. And the shovel led police to believe that Shirley had likely been buried somewhere close by. But a thorough search failed to produce the victim's body. Now, police wanted to speak with the man who had the most to gain from her disappearance. Her ex-common law husband and the father of 3 of her children. Doug Beamish admitted that he and Shirley's relationship had been troubled in the past. And he realized that her family probably blamed him for her disappearance. But he insisted he knew nothing about it. For the sake of the children, he and Shirley had managed to work out their problems. He said he last saw her a week or so earlier. He had been having car problems, and Shirley offered to give him a ride to a job site where he was employed as a construction worker. On the way there, they had a pleasant conversation about their kids and planned to speak more later. She then dropped him off at the site, and the two said goodbye. He hadn't heard from her since. Doug Beamish sensed that something was bothering Shirley. He speculated that she had left town to visit some friends in Toronto. But it turned out that no one there had heard from her in some time.
RCMP Inspector McNeil speaking.
Then, police got a call.
North End one?
A woman who had been following the case in the media believed she had important information.
This lady called and she said, I remember back around the time that Shirley Duguay went missing, I saw a car similar to hers on a road called the Allen Road, which would be about 20 kilometers away from where we found the car. I remember it was in the evening, it was dark. I saw 2 people on the side of the road, a tall man, a very small woman. They appeared to be arguing, and I just drove by, and I don't know if it's any good to you or not.
The woman couldn't be certain she had in fact seen Shirley Duguay. Still, the information was enough for police to search the area where the caller had seen the couple. But to cover the several square miles, they knew they needed help. Personnel from the Canadian Army agreed to participate in the search. For several days, their efforts turned up nothing. But then they found something that seemed out of place.
One group came across a white plastic bag. We had a police officer with every group of searchers from the military. The police officer seized the bag.
The search of the area failed to produce any additional evidence. At the crime lab, examiners carefully removed the contents of the plastic bag. They recovered an old pair of white tennis shoes. There was also a large man's jacket stuffed inside. Several fibers and a single white hair were recovered. But further scrutiny revealed the presence of tiny stains that tested positive for human blood. Based on the information provided by the witness, police believed it had originated from Shirley Duguay. Now they needed to prove it. But there was a problem.
We didn't have Shirley Duguay, so we needed to be able to develop a DNA profile. The way we did that's what's called, in some cases, reverse paternity. We took a sample from her father, her brother, and her 2 sons.
Though everyone's DNA is unique, a genetic family resemblance exists among blood relatives. When the genetic profiles were compared, examiners concluded that the blood found on all of the evidence had originated from Shirley Duguay. Though the 32-year-old mother's whereabouts remained uncertain, all the evidence suggested she had been the victim of a violent crime. Police on Canada's Prince Edward Island continued searching for missing 32-year-old mother of 5, Shirley Duguay. Though efforts to find her had gone unsuccessful, authorities had found clues suggesting she had met with a violent fate. Among them was a man's jacket, found stained with blood that had originated from Shirley. Looking for clues as to who might want to harm the young mother, officers from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police questioned Shirley's friends. They all believed that Shirley's ex-husband, Doug Beamish, was somehow involved in the disappearance. Recently, Shirley had started dating again. That had enraged her possessive and jealous ex-husband. And Doug Beamish had a history of violence.
When was the last time you saw those guys?
But the friend didn't recall if Beamish owned a jacket like the one found with Shirley's blood on it. Doug Beamish was emerging as the prime suspect in Shirley Duguay's disappearance.
Andre's down with the IDent guys right now looking.
But so far, investigators had no physical evidence to prove it.
But, you know, without that jacket being able to tie it to someone wearing, we don't have much. Andre, how did you make out with
Then they got a break.
We've got something. IDent just came back. They found some white cat hair on the inside of the jacket. And all I could think about all the way down here was Beamish and his white cat in his house.
That was all RCMP Inspector Alphonse McNeil needed to hear.
We knew that he had a white cat and there were white hairs in the jacket. So the process then was to find a lab that could examine these if we were able to seize from blood from the cat.
With a warrant in hand, police and a local veterinarian returned to Doug Beamish's house. The suspect continued to deny any involvement in Shirley's disappearance and claimed that he didn't own a jacket like the one stained with her blood. Though it seemed like a long shot, authorities took possession of his cat, Snowball, hopeful they could somehow establish a genetic link to the hair found on the blood-stained jacket. Blood and hair samples were collected from Beamish's cat. But now, investigators had to find someone who was an expert in analyzing cat DNA. At the National Cancer Institute in Frederick, Maryland, they found one. There, biologist Dr. Stephen O'Brien has looked to the feline genetic code for help in medical research. When contacted, he agreed to help Canadian police. But Dr. O'Brien and his team never imagined that by cracking the feline genetic code, they might also help crack a baffling criminal case. The request to match a cat's DNA was unique in medical and legal history. First, examiners generated a genetic profile of the white hair pulled from the bloody jacket. Once completed, the results were then compared to the profile generated from the samples taken from Snowball.
What we discovered was that the genotype was identical to what we had seen in the jacket hair. So we were pretty sure that the jacket hair had come from a cat which had the same genotype as Snowball.
Though the scientists felt confident about the results, they could not be absolutely certain of them. It was possible that the few thousand cats roaming on the isolated Prince Edward Island shared a common ancestry. To find out, biologists needed to generate more DNA profiles of other cats on the island.
We had to determine what the status of the population was so that we could make the calculation of how likely it was that we were wrong in pronouncing a match.
Examiners went to work developing the genetic profiles of 20 randomly selected cats on the island. When O'Brien compared the results, he found that none shared a DNA signature similar to Snowball's. In fact, the odds that the hair found on the jacket had not come from Beamish's cat were 45 million to 1.
Please, and your socks.
Through Snowball, authorities had established a link between Doug Beamish and a jacket stained with his ex-wife's blood. But Inspector Alphonse McNeil wasn't satisfied.
You step out 1 foot at a time.
Next, he obtained a warrant to collect impressions of the suspect's feet.
Good. Just step out 1 foot at a time.
Now, he hoped to tie the suspect to the pair of white running shoes found with the jacket.
We thought, well, if we can put those running shoes on the feet of Douglas Beamish somehow, that would be pretty solid evidence besides his cat.
Dr. Keith Bettles, a forensic podiatrist, received the evidence. He began by creating plaster casts of the suspect's feet in order to reveal all of the unique characteristics.
People's feet are unique because we walk on them all the time. We have lots of different stresses, lots of different forces on our feet. Feet are practically as individual as fingerprints.
The casts of Beamish's feet lined up perfectly with all of the wear patterns observed on the insoles of the white shoes. A single strand of cat hair and a discarded pair of shoes had given investigators the evidence they needed to implicate Doug Beamish in the disappearance of his ex-common-law wife. Then, 7 months after Shirley Duguay went missing, badly decomposed human remains were discovered buried in a remote wooded area. Dental records later confirmed that the victim was Shirley Duguay. And the medical examiner classified her death as a homicide. A short while later, Douglas Beamish was placed under arrest and charged with first-degree murder. Investigators believe that Beamish couldn't handle Shirley Duguay dating other men. Somehow, he manipulated her into giving him a ride in her car and directed her to a remote spot. Once there, he beat his ex-common-law wife to death. He then buried her body in a remote area and abandoned the car. Douglas Beamish was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. No place is immune from violent crime. And even the friendliest towns have their problems. Mansfield, Ohio has been called one of America's most livable cities, which makes what happened here all the more surprising. On January 2nd, 1990, a woman came in to speak with Mansfield police.
Yes, ma'am. What can I do for you?
She was concerned that something had happened to her friend, 44-year-old Noreen Boyle. When she last saw her friend a few days earlier, Noreen was shaken and visibly upset. Her marriage of more than 22 years was falling apart. And not only was her husband moving nearly 200 miles away to Erie, Pennsylvania, but he would likely take the couple's 2 children with him. Noreen was devastated. When she tried to contact her, Noreen's husband, a prominent local physician, said Noreen had packed up and left town after a fight. But the friend couldn't believe that Noreen would walk out on her 2 children. Mansfield police agreed to look into the case. And their first step was to question Noreen's husband, Dr. John Boyle. When Lieutenant David Messmore arrived at the residence, he learned that John Boyle was out of town. John Boyle's mother explained that he had driven to Erie, Pennsylvania a few days earlier, where he was opening up his new medical practice. He was due back later that evening. When questioned, she said that Noreen walked out on the family a few days earlier, and she was watching the couple's children until her son John returned home. The woman excused herself to check on the Boyles' baby daughter. Then, the couple's son approached the detective.
My mom would never do something like that.
He said he was afraid something bad had happened to his mother. But before he could explain, his grandmother returned.
I'm really sorry. I have no more information.
When she saw what was happening, she ended the interview and asked the detective to
I
leave.
really have nothing more to tell you. I really need to have you leave.
The encounter troubled police.
He's from Mansfield.
And Lieutenant Messmore couldn't ignore that Dr. Boyle had left town around the same time his wife was reported missing.
I'm not sure where it's at.
But he soon learned that the reason for the doctor's trip to Pennsylvania checked out.
He had been hired by a very large medical corporation in Erie, Pennsylvania. So he was basically traveling back and forth between Mansfield and Erie for some period of time.
But where was Noreen Boyle? Later that evening, Detective Messmore returned to the residence. His visit had been anticipated. Dr. Boyle's lawyer answered the door.
You represent Dr. Boyle? I do. Oh, okay. Is he home right now?
Well, his client had in fact returned home from Pennsylvania. But because of the strain caused by the impending divorce, Dr. Boyle did not wish to discuss Noreen with police.
All right, well, I'll get with you later.
It wasn't the response investigators expected.
I was somewhat stunned that in the event of a missing person in your family, you would hire an attorney to represent you when there's no accusations or even any allegations of wrongdoing or even criminal matters involving the family. So that was certainly a very unusual situation.
I was not the only nurse.
To find out what Dr. Boyle might be trying to hide, police questioned his friends and co-workers. Professionally, all agreed Dr. Boyle had an impeccable reputation. But personally, he was known to be a womanizer and rumored to be involved in numerous affairs. In fact, one of his alleged mistresses was pregnant. And everyone speculated that the child belonged to Dr. Boyle. Though that made him a bad husband, it didn't mean he was capable of physical violence. In fact, only one person seemed to believe otherwise, and that was the Boyle son. Concerned for the child's well-being, Lieutenant Messmore caught up with him after school. The child was eager to tell his story. He said that the night before his mom disappeared, the sound of his parents arguing outside his bedroom woke him up.
I heard a big thump on the wall.
He heard a loud
And my
thud,
dad came,
and then there was
threw me in the
silence.
bedroom, I was sleeping.
A few seconds later, his dad peeked into his room. The boy was afraid and pretended to be asleep. The next morning, his mom was gone. His dad told him that she packed up and left. But he didn't believe his mom would leave without saying goodbye.
Did you have a conversation with your dad at all?
Though police had no evidence that a crime had been committed, they began to theorize that the noise heard by the child might have been the sound of his own mother being assaulted, or worse. Police in Mansfield, Ohio continued their search for missing mother of two, Noreen Boyle. And now they theorized that her husband, Dr. John Boyle, was somehow involved. Though police had no hard evidence that a crime had taken place, they were able to obtain a warrant to search the Boyles' Ohio residence. Using luminol, a chemical that reacts to the proteins found in blood, technicians began scouring the house. But their efforts failed to turn up any evidence of a violent crime. Still, investigators persisted. To learn more, they contacted authorities in Erie, Pennsylvania, where Dr. Boyle was setting up his new medical practice.
Hi, Mill Creek Township Police Department.
Pennsylvania detectives tracked down a real estate agent there who had recently sold a house to Dr. Boyle and a pregnant woman who introduced herself as his wife. She recalled that Dr. Boyle was particularly interested in the home's concrete basement floor. He said he was eager to tear it up in order to build a playroom for his children. He offered to pay the asking price as long as he could take possession of the house immediately. The real estate agent turned over the sales agreement, which was signed by both the doctor and his wife. Pennsylvania authorities forwarded a copy to Mansfield Police Lieutenant David Messmore.
In that copy, it was noted that Dr. Boyle signed it, and also an N. Sherry Boyle. And checking further into the background, it was quite obvious that Noreen's name was not Sherry for a middle name.
Dr. Boyle had purchased the home with a woman pretending to be his wife. Investigators subpoenaed the suspect's most recent credit card statements. They learned that he had used his card to rent a jackhammer and to purchase indoor-outdoor carpeting and a load of concrete. Suddenly, all of the pieces were adding up.
I had the feeling and very strong suspicion that the body would be in that location.
Pennsylvania authorities issued a warrant to search the basement of Dr. Boyle's new home. Beneath some shelving and the indoor-outdoor carpeting, they found a badly poured patch of concrete. It was roughly the size of a makeshift grave. A crew was called in to dig up the concrete floor. After some time, they recognized the unmistakable smell of a decaying body. Then, a few feet down, they discovered a tarp. And inside were the badly decomposed remains of a human body. After carefully excavating the grave, the remains were transported to the medical examiner's office. A watch and other pieces of jewelry worn by the victim matched the description of those worn by Noreen Boyle. and dental records confirmed that the victim was, in fact, the 44-year-old mother of two. Noreen had been savagely murdered.
Looking for Dr. Boyle?
On January 26, 1990, almost a month after his wife disappeared, Dr. John Boyle was arrested in Ohio for suspicion of killing Noreen. Despite the evidence against him, the doctor maintained his innocence.
Okay, sir.
Someone was trying to frame him. That seemed ridiculous to investigators. But to ensure a conviction, they needed an eyewitness or physical evidence directly linking him to the homicide. And so far, they had neither. It was possible that Dr. Boyle could get away with murder. But then, nearly a week after Dr. John Boyle's arrest, a Mansfield, Ohio resident made a strange discovery. A pile of concrete had been dumped on the remote property. The field was nearly 200 miles away from where Noreen Boyle's body had been unearthed. But the man had followed the case in the media and thought there might be a connection. A crime scene technician was dispatched to the scene. After photographing the area, the concrete was collected into evidence. Police later determined that the property was owned by a close friend of Dr. Boyle's. The doctor had been there on numerous occasions. But to prove murder, police now needed to show that the concrete found in Ohio had originated in the suspect's Pennsylvania home. Police had found missing 44-year-old Noreen Boyle buried in the basement of her husband's new Pennsylvania home. Though investigators had a strong circumstantial case against her husband, they hoped a pile of concrete found in an Ohio field could physically link him to the murder. The samples collected from the field, along with concrete taken from the crime scene, were sent to CTL Engineering in Columbus, Ohio. There, lab supervisor Larry Piscitelli is an expert in analyzing the microscopic nature of rocks and concrete. Without being told where the individual samples had come from, he was asked to determine if any of the concrete pieces had originated from the same source. To analyze the internal structure of the concrete, the samples are cut into cross-sectional pieces using a diamond-tipped saw. Once completed, the surfaces are smoothed and polished. Then, Piscitelli subjected the evidence to a high-powered microscope. Concrete is a mixture of stones, gravel, and sand, called aggregate, bound together by a cement paste and some trapped air. With the help of a computer, Piscitelli measures and counts each of these components. To the average eye, all concrete looks pretty much alike. But in fact, each chunk has a unique story.
Each piece of concrete is usually different because the components vary slightly. Even if they come from the same load of concrete, two different samples from the same truckload can be different because the percentages of the air voids, the small entrained or entrapped air voids, can be slightly different.
Piscitelli was unable to find significant similarities between most of the samples. But when he analyzed the results, he found that two of the pieces stood out from the rest. They shared the exact same number of unique components.
These two pieces of concrete had some unique characteristics that were peculiar just to those two pieces of concrete, and based on all the data and analysis, the numbers being exactly the same, I was able to show that those two pieces of concrete came from the same structure.
Of the two samples that matched, one had come from the pile of rubble found in Mansfield, Ohio. The other was collected in the basement of the suspect's new home in Erie, Pennsylvania. Police now had enough to charge Dr. John Boyle with murder. Police believe that John Boyle murdered his wife in the couple's home in order to start a new life with his pregnant mistress. After the kill, he drove her body to Pennsylvania and buried her in a grave he had dug in the basement of his new home. Investigators theorize he then returned to Ohio and dumped the leftover concrete on his friend's property. Dr. John Boyle was convicted of aggravated murder and abuse of a corpse. He was sentenced to 20 years to life. John Boyle thought he'd buried all evidence of his crime. But in fact, the trail of evidence spanned 200 miles. Other murders are more local, but the road to solving them can be just as long. In Harrison County, Missouri, on June 26, 1995, a farmer out for a walk noticed a foul odor. At first, he thought that maybe one of his livestock had died. But the reality was much worse. Hidden among some overgrowth lay the lifeless body of a man. After receiving the 911 call, dispatchers contacted officers of the Major Case Squad, a group of law enforcement personnel from several neighboring jurisdictions. Bethany Police Chief George Martz was among the first to respond to the scene.
We had no idea when we arrived who the victim was. There was no identification on the body that we were able to determine at that time.
But the manner in which he died was clear. He had been shot several times. Police recovered an empty box of ammunition. And a few feet away, they found several spent shotgun shell casings. Then, Sheriff Greg Kuhn from the nearby Grundy County Sheriff's Department arrived at the location. He believed he recognized the victim as a local resident by the name of Al Pinniger.
After I looked at the body, I felt that it might have been Al Pinniger, who I had dealt with in the past in Grundy County. Really couldn't tell for sure, but it just appeared to me that might be who it was.
Unsure what was evidence and what was roadside trash, investigators collected numerous items scattered around the area. They found and collected a small plastic clock. On the back was torn adhesive with tiny synthetic fibers clinging to it. They also located a single strand of brown leather lying in the middle of the road. Police hoped that somewhere among the debris were clues that could explain this brutal murder. At autopsy, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim had died as a result of several 12-gauge shotgun blasts. He'd been shot twice in the back and once in the face. The victim's fingerprints were lifted and then passed on to Harrison County Police. Investigators requested Al Pinniger's fingerprint card, which was on file in Grundy County. When they compared those prints with the ones taken from the homicide victim, they found a perfect match. Now, detectives from the Major Case Squad had to figure out who wanted Al Pinniger dead.
Major Case Squad.
Soon they got their first break.
Okay, and when did she report him missing?
Police learned that the victim had been reported missing a few days before his body was discovered.
Okay, thanks for calling.
And the report had been filed by his fiancée. Police immediately arranged for an interview. The victim's fiancée told detectives that she and Al had been living together for some time. She said that she last saw him a few hours before he went missing.
Need anything from the store?
She had left the house to go run a few errands.
All right, I'll see you later.
Al said he was going to cut the grass and do some work around the house. He hadn't mentioned any plans to leave that day.
5 days ago.
Recently, she had been trying to help him overcome a drug problem. He had been doing his best to stay far away from his drug-dealing friends.
John Middleton and
Usually stay in the middle of the line, or was it great?
She suspected, however, that he had seen some of them that day. When she returned home later that afternoon, she passed a pickup truck coming out of her neighborhood. She didn't see Al in the truck, but she knew the vehicle belonged to a couple that he used to deal drugs with.
So he's been dealing with drugs?
She believed Al may have been ducking down to avoid being seen.
when I was driving.
When the fiancé arrived home, she discovered that Al and his 12-gauge shotgun were gone. The information provided police with their first real lead.
Okay, guys, here's what we got.
They ran a background check on the couple, identified as John Middleton and his girlfriend Maggie Hodges.
Decomposed. You and Rodney.
Middleton had an extensive criminal record, mostly involving drug-related offenses. To find out why he may have wanted to harm Al Pinniger, police tracked down Middleton's known associates. One informant described Middleton as an extremely unstable and violent person.
Hodges and Middleton.
He said that as a result of police efforts to crack down on local drug dealers, John Middleton had become increasingly paranoid. He threatened to kill people he did business with if he found out they were cooperating with authorities. No one doubted him for a minute. Everyone was afraid of him. All of the information led police to suspect that Middleton's paranoia had likely led to the murder of Al Pinniger. And they hoped that somewhere among the shotgun shells and the assorted litter collected from the crime scene was the means to prove it. Police in Harrison County, Missouri believed that a local drug dealer and his girlfriend were responsible for the brutal shotgun slaying of 29-year-old Alfred Pinniger. To prove it, investigators needed to physically link the suspects to the crime scene. Though several potential clues had been found there, an empty box of shotgun shells looked to be the most promising lead. A price sticker found on the box led investigators to the store where the ammo had originated. An employee there pulled recent sales records. According to receipts, several boxes of shells were bought on the day of the murder. The clerk recalled that 2 men and a woman had come in together to make the purchases. She also remembered something else. A few hours after the purchase, 2 of the 3 customers returned to the store. They had unused cartridges and wanted to return them for a refund. The clerk didn't recall seeing the other man who had been in with them earlier. When shown photographs, she picked out Al Pinniger, John Middleton, and Maggie Hodges as the 3 who bought the boxes of ammo earlier that day.
Did she come back the second time?
Yeah.
And she identified Middleton and Hodges as the 2 who came back to return the unused ammo. Though the evidence didn't prove murder, it was enough for police to obtain arrest warrants. Believing that Middleton and his girlfriend were capable of great violence, police cautiously approached the house they shared together. John Middleton was quickly subdued. Moments later, Maggie Hodges was also taken into custody. After the suspects were removed from the scene, police began searching for proof of murder. Inside Middleton's pickup truck, they collected a fringed brown leather jacket. As the search continued, technicians found a potential clue. Bethany Police Chief George Martz.
We took a piece of the dashboard from the Middleton truck that had a sticky substance on it, and on that sticky substance were fibers. Those fibers appeared to match the clock we found at the crime scene. So we removed a piece of the dash, the entire dash, and sent that to the lab for analysis.
All of the evidence was forwarded to the Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab, located in Jefferson City. There, criminalist Kathleen Green worked the case. Almost immediately, she noticed that the fringes on the brown leather jacket appeared identical to a piece of brown leather found at the crime scene.
I looked at the jacket to see if there was any fringe missing from it, and did find an area where there was a piece of fringe missing. I then compared the question end of the fringe to the question area on the jacket to determine if it was originally attached to it.
Though the pieces lined up well, Green was unable to conclusively state that the piece of leather had in fact come from Middleton's jacket. She turned her attention to the stick-on clock found near Al Pinniger's body. When she compared the adhesive on the back of the clock to the adhesive stuck to Middleton's dashboard, she found numerous similarities.
It was the same size, it had the same coloring, they were both made of the same type of material.
When the torn edges of the two pieces were placed side by side under a comparison microscope, examiners found a match. Next, fibers found on the stick-on clock were compared to carpet samples collected from the vehicle. Criminalist Jenny Smith found one consistency after another.
We determined that the fiber from the clock face, this would have been considered the question fiber, was similar in physical and chemical composition to the fiber from the suspect vehicle. Therefore, we would conclude that this fiber, question fiber, could have come from this vehicle.
When confronted with the evidence, Middleton was uncooperative.
This is your opportunity to tell your side of the story. We know what the story is.
But his resistance didn't matter. Police had pieced together the motive behind the murder.
Do you think about this real long?
My belief is that Mr. Middleton thought Alfred Pinniger was about to rat him out to the police department and to law enforcement authorities, and Mr. Middleton was not going to allow that to happen. You're in some bad trouble.
But Middleton was wrong. The victim had made no attempt to contact authorities. Police believe that on the day of the murder, John Middleton and Maggie Hodges drove to Al Pinniger's house. They asked him to go target shooting, and he agreed. What he didn't know was that he was the intended target. At some point, however, that became clear. A scuffle started inside the car. Pinniger escaped, but he didn't get far. John Middleton was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Maggie Hodges pled guilty and was sentenced to 50 years in prison. It takes motive and opportunity to commit a murder. And it takes hard evidence to solve one. When clues are few, forensics experts provide the know-how to turn the most ordinary object into a material witness.